Hi, everyone. I'm going to do a video today on just how Paul is depicted in art and whether it's accurate or not. And the depiction you're seeing on the screen is accurate according to friends who described Paul, who were his associates. And Onesiphorus, a contemporary of Paul's day, in his work Acts of Paul and Thecla, described Paul as, quote, a man small in stature with a bald head and crooked legs, with eyebrows meeting and nose somewhat hooked. Christians. This is an article, Christians Among Jews and Gentiles, Harvard Theological Review, Volume 79, Issue 1-3, July 1986, at pages 170 to 175. So this is the painting of Albert Durer, 1526, and a larger painting entitled Four Apostles. And this is a larger painting here to the left, and I hope you can see that there's what it is it's not actually four apostles. Mark is in there, and there are two others, as this article will explain here. So let me read it. You can see there at the top, it says Albrecht Dürer, The Four Apostles, 1526. Barbara Pitkin wrote an article in 2011 in the at the website the www.journeywithjesus. She is a member of the Grace Lutheran Church in Palo Alto, California, PhD, senior lecturer, religious studies at Stanford, and so on. And this is what she wrote about this in an article in 2011. 485 years ago this month, the Renaissance painter Albrecht Dürer presented the town council of Nuremberg, Germany, with an extraordinary gift, a painting consisting of twin panels portraying four New Testament authors, accompanied by didactic verses drawn from the writings attributed to each. These biblical passages were taken from the first edition of Luther's German Testament that was a runaway bestseller, published in 1522. The customary title of the painting, Four Apostles, is somewhat misleading, since only three of the four men depicted, Saints John, Peter, and Paul, were strictly speaking apostles. I'll just let that go. The fourth, Saint Mark, though an evangelist, was traditionally thought to be a disciple of the apostle Peter. Currently housed in the Alte Pinakothek Museum of Munich, Durer's masterpiece represents one of his greatest achievements. So again, what we're seeing here is someone who is bald, who his eyebrows seem close together, a crooked nose. So Albert Durer is doing that correctly. The only thing that does not make quite sense is he's supposed to be small in stature, and if you look here, he is taller than Mark. In fact, Paul almost appears taller than John, who's all the way to the left. So Paul is taller than Peter and Mark, who are the two figures in the middle. So now let's ask ourselves, what's going on here? And when you listen to what Barbara Pitkin, this person who's a senior lecturer in religious studies at Stanford, she's going to tell you what's propagandistic about this, but she's all in favor of it, the way she depicts it. So let me read you what she says, and I'm going to say this is wrong. He should have been depicted exactly the way he is depicted by his contemporaries, as a short in stature person. But that's not what's going on here. So listen to what she says. There is no iconographic tradition before Durer for portraying these four biblical writers together, but in light of Luther's view on the primacy of the gospel and where it is especially to be found, the logic of the figures as well as their arrangement is easily grasped. So in other words, she's saying Durer is conveying something about what Luther believes is the gospel. Where is Peter and Mark in this? Way below John. And again, that depends on Luther's using the translation of the word pistoo as only the German word for faith or belief, which again, the King James Bible knew that the word there didn't mean believe. They knew it meant obey. And when it came to John 2, where this word was used about Jesus believing, or excuse me, bestowing to somebody else, he refused to bestow onto people who wanted him to do a revolt, lead a revolt. And they translated it there correctly. He would not commit himself to them. He would not obey their requests. So they knew, the King James knew in 1611, the word bestow meant obey, because they did it one time right when it was reversed, where Jesus wouldn't bestow onto someone else. Then he wouldn't follow them. He wouldn't obey them. He wouldn't take their lead. So they knew, but this is But again, if you're Luther and you've mistranslated, and maybe even honestly, because in 1522, when he did the German Bible, he may not have known what the word pisto meant. That's possible. By 1611, we know for a fact the King James Version knew what it was doing because of that passage in John 2 about he would not commit him. Go look at it. He would not commit himself to these people who wanted him to do a revolt. All right. Anyway, John on the left and Paul on the right dominate the composition. And that's another thing. Look how small Peter and look how small Mark are compared to the great Paul and the great John, the gospel of faith alone, which it isn't. It's the opposite. It's the obedience to Christ, not the faith in Christ. But that was Luther's desire to make it look like that. And John on the left and Paul on the right dominate the composition, larger and lighter than Peter and Mark in the background. So there's more light on Paul and John. She senses this in the composition, meaning that makes them more important and having more light maybe for us. The robes partially obscure the other figures, even as the books they hold mediate access to them. So Paul apparently is holding the law, the entire Bible, the what they call the Old Testament and the New Testament, and John only has open his his chapter 1, the preface, and of course, as it's been mistranslated, misread, somehow people think that Jesus is the Word. God is the Word, and Jesus is called the Word. That's a different thing in Jewish thought. You can be called something, which doesn't mean that's who you are. It means that's what you're called because you symbolize what that name you have. But you are not actually the Word. The Word came to dwell in flesh, the flesh of Jesus. Jesus says in John 4, I think it's 14:10, the Father dwells in me. So that means he's not he's not the Word. And basically also the word is logos in verse 1 of John 1, the prologue. The logos comes to dwell in flesh, and then Jesus makes it very clear the logos you hear is not mine. It belongs to him who sent me. How does one mix up the fact that Jesus is logos when he says the logos isn't even mine? So again, it's dwarfs the human capacity to understand how people can't. If you don't know the Greek and you're not showing the people the Greek words, I'm all I'm going to say, if you could see the Greek words, you would never conclude Jesus is the Logos, because he says, the words I speak are not mine. The Logos I speak isn't mine. But because you're given different words, it would, instead of Logos later being Logos, it's translated as teaching. So instead of it being the word you hear is not mine, or the Logos you hear is not mine, which would have been perfect, it's now the teaching you hear is not mine. Okay. Or things to that effect, or the words, the pluralize it, even though it's a singular. So again, it's just a corruption that is just keeps us in darkness. But anyway, let's continue. Their robes partially obscure the other figures, even as the books they hold mediate access to them. Peter was not only the presumed author of the epistle prized by Luther, along with the writings of Paul and John, so he liked First Peter, but I think he didn't read the whole thing. Let me just say that it's a that's a whole nother thing. He was also the apostle to whom the keys of the church had been given and the predecessor of the Pope. Okay. So now that may mean Peter should be inferior because the office he held or created in Rome, which he actually wasn't, by the way, he was never the bishop of Rome. He appointed a bishop of Rome, but it wasn't himself. Goes back into if you study Catholic history, the first pope wasn't they. You would think they claim Peter's their first pope, but no, that's not true. Claim somebody else. And it wasn't even called pope; it was just called the bishop. All right, or the overseer. All right, Peter was not only presumed author of the epistle prized by Luther, along with the writings of Paul and John, he was also the apostle to whom the keys of the church have been given and the predecessor of the Pope. He is here subordinated to John and reads in John's gospel for guidance. Oh, okay. So this is Peter to the left of Paul, more further to the left of Paul, and right next to John. So Peter is learning from John the true gospel of Christ. This is faith alone person. Again, all based on a fraudulent Mistake maybe of Luther, but clearly fraudulent by the time of the King James, because as I said, in John 2, they know it doesn't mean believe because they translated it differently to being commit, which is the same thing as obey, when Jesus uses the word in relation to other people. Okay. So, but we have a whole series on that. Here he is supported. Peter is subordinated to John and reads in John's gospel for guidance. Of the other three evangelists, Mark is the one whose gospel begins with direct mention of the gospel message. Quote, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Mark 1, verse 1. Yet he too, author of a great many of the deeds of Christ, needs to look to Paul, whose clear articulation of the gospel provides the key not only to Mark, but to testing all the rest of Scripture. So you can see that Mark is looking up to Paul. So that height, that extra height, is to say Mark has to look up to somebody else. And so this is a piece of pure propaganda. That's what she's not telling you. She doesn't use that word. She doesn't use a pejorative, but that's what this is. This is recreating history. A man who was short in stature is now going to be taller than Mark, and then you have this idea that there's John is supposed to be in agreement with Paul, which is totally false. It's the opposite, the exact opposite. Once you know the word pistow does not mean believe. And what, again, I show you, there's 8 of the oldest lexicons all agree it means obey, and I have a whole video series on that. And NIV Theological is very precise in 2001, and it did in all its editions since then have all continued to have this word and continue to expand, where it says when the word pistow is used in direction of a person, it means obey. That's its words, not Doug's. The NIV Theological Dictionary, and but they're all, and it's published by Zondervan. The same people came out with the NIV dictionary, but the NIV Bible, but the NIV Bible will not follow the NIV Theological Dictionary. Why? Because theologians are the ones who are translating in the NIV, not the not the translators who actually created a theological dictionary to help teach them what they're supposed to be doing, and they won't do it. They refuse. It is a theological decision to make it appear that John is a faith alone gospel, and this is all this is also propaganda in this. It's a pro faith alone view of John's gospel. So how would you ever get rid of this fraud? Now it becomes a fraud, because now we absolutely know. We have all these historians of Greek from this, and that's what I mean by these 8 lexicons, major lexicons, including a German lexicon, that they are translated. All of these all agree that in this context, in the way John was using it, and particularly John, it meant obey. And you can't get through. You can't break these lexicons. Can't not break through this theological barrier. It's like a stone wall that won't let it go. And here's the propaganda based. This propaganda, this emphasis that you can't let go of John, is he's part of Paul. No, he's the antithesis of Paul. That's the odd thing. That's the bizarre odd thing. But this propaganda would make you think, oh, well, it's just an accepted fact. If the painting shows John is, equally important as Paul, and Luther's very clear. He thinks only the Gospel of John among the 4 Gospels should be read, because it gives glory to the idea of faith, which which it gives idea to it's all glory about obeying Jesus Christ, obeying him, following him, following his teachings. That's what it's all about. But you've been given a distorted picture, and just like this picture is distorted. Look at how inflated Paul's stature is. That's how inflated in your mind is Paul's doctrines over Jesus Christ, and how even a gospel that is the most pro obedience to Christ, the most clear that you could possibly be, the true gospel is obeying Christ, and it's been totally eviscerated from its real mooring, its real point, and you get it that he's supposed to be like a pal of Paul. Give me a break. And the book of Revelation makes it impossible to believe that John is on Paul's side, because the scholars now agree that's not the message of Revelation, which we'll get into, or we have gotten into in many episodes. Okay, so it is a work of propaganda. Okay, now I want to show you another work of propaganda, which is this movie from about 2 years ago. And I don't mean the content of it. I mean the depiction of Paul as this virile, tall, handsome person. Here, this is a picture of the movie. The title of the movie on YouTube is Paul the Apostle, parenthetical St. Paul, full movie, Johannes Brandrup, Thomas Lockyer, and Barbara Bubalova. So look at that guy. He's tall, he's handsome, he's doesn't have a crooked nose, he doesn't have a unibrow, he's not bald. Uh, he doesn't have crooked legs. Well, of course, you can't see them under a robe anyway. But I mean, it's totally fallacious. I mean, they know Onesiphorus wrote a complimentary biography of Paul. He loved Paul, but he was honest enough to tell you what he looked like. And but you get a completely false image of him. And I actually think it's historically necessary to depict people the way they looked if you have pictures of them. Can you imagine depicting Delano Roosevelt while he's in his wheelchair during World War II, walking around as a virile man with no problem? No, it's kind of important to this history of what his physical limitations and what he looked like and how people would think of him because of where he was in this wheelchair all the time. And so it's part of history. You don't change history to make somebody look better than he really was. So that's what I'm saying here. So we are still being propagandized all the time to see Paul in a completely unrealistic light, just as Durer intended in his painting many years ago, 1526. All right, I hope that makes a statement here. And the only true depiction of Paul, see that little circle there with Paul in the middle? That is the only part of the painting that is true. The rest of it is false, meaning he isn't that tall. We know for a fact what Paul looked like because he was depicted by others. So I believe we must be historically true to things and not propagandize as to make somebody look totally different than the way we know from history, from the way he was described in history to be by people who were not antagonistic to him, who were friends and speaking friendly, just honestly described how that person looked. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.